Okay, everyone, I'm going to read chapter 11 and 12 for you. So, chapter 11, The Journey North on the Ickabog. King Fred's spirits rose higher and higher as he rode out of Chalksville and into the countryside. Word of the king's sudden expedition to find the Ickabog had now spread to the farmers who worked the rolling green fields, and they ran with their families to cheer the king, the two lords, and the royal guard as they passed. Not having had any lunch, the king decided to stop in Kurdsburg to eat a late dinner. We'll rough it here, chaps, like the soldiers we are, he cried as his party as they entered the city famed for its cheese, and we'll set out again at first light. But of course, there was no question of the king roughing it. Visitors of Kingsburg's finest inn were thrown out onto the street to make way for him. So Fred slept that night in a brass bed with a duck down mattress after a hearty meal of toasted cheese and chocolate fondue. The Lords Spittleworth and Flapoon, on the other hand, were forced to spend the night in a little room over the stable. Both were rather sore after a long day of horseback. You may wonder why that was if they went hunting 5 times a week. But the truth was that they generally sneaked off to sit behind a tree after half an hour's hunting, where they ate sandwiches and drank wine until it was time to go back to the palace. Neither was used to spending hours in the saddle, and Spittleworth's bony bottom was already starting to blister. Early the following morning, the king was brought word by Major Beamish that the citizens of Baronstown were very upset the king had chosen to sleep in Kurdsburg rather than their splendid city. Eager not to dent his popularity, King Fred instructed his party to ride in an enormous circle through the surrounding fields, being cheered by farmers all the way, so that they ended up in Baronstown by nightfall. The delicious smell of sizzling sausage greeted the royal party, and a delighted crowd carried torches escorted Fred to the best room in the city. There he was served roasted ox and honey ham and slept in a carved oak bed with a goose down mattress, while Spittlesworth and Flapoon had to share a tiny attic room usually occupied by two maids. By now, Spittlesworth's bottom was extremely painful, and he was furious that he'd been forced to ride 40 miles in a circle, purely to keep the sausage makers happy. Lapoon, who'd eaten far too much cheese in Kurdsburg and had consumed 3 beefsteaks in Baronstown, was awake all night groaning with indigestion. The next day, the king and his men set off again, and this time they headed north, soon passing through vineyards from which eager grape pickers emerged to wave corn Napoleon flags and receive waves from um, jubilant king. Spittlesworth was almost crying from pain in spite of the cushion he'd strapped it to his bottom, and Flapoon's belches and moans could be heard even over the clatter of hooves and jingle of bridles. Upon arriving at Jeroboam that evening, they were greeted by trumpets and the entire city singing the national anthem. Fred feasted on sparkling wine and truffles that night before retiring to a silken four-poster bed with a swanson down mattress, but Spittleworth and Flapoon were forced to share a room over the inn's kitchen with a pair of soldiers. Drunken Jeroboam dwellers were reeling about in the streets, celebrating the presence of the king in their city. Spittleworth spent much of the night sitting in a bucket of ice, and Flapoon, who'd who had drank too much red wine spent the same period being sick in a second bucket in the corner. At dawn next morning, the king and his party set out for the marshlands after a famous farewell from the citizens of Jeroboam, who saw him on his way with a thunderous popping of corks that made Spittleworth's horse rear and ditch him on the road. Once they dusted Spittleworth off and put the cushion back on his bottom, and Fred had stopped laughing, the party proceeded. Soon they led Jeroboam behind and could hear only bird song. For the first time in their entire journey, the sides of the road were empty. Gradually, the lush green land gave way to thin, dry grass, crooked trees, and boulders. Extraordinary place, isn't it? The cheerful king shouted back to Spittleworth and Flood. I'm jolly glad to see these marshlands at last. Aren't you? The two lords agreed, but once Fred had turned to face the front again, made rude gestures and mouthed even ruder names at the back of his head. At last the royal party came across the few people, and how the marshlanders stared. They fell to their knees like the shepherd in the throne room and quite forgot to cheer or clap, but gaped as though they'd never seen anything like the king and the royal guard before. Which indeed they hadn't, because while King Fred had visited all the major cities of Cornucopia after his coronation, nobody had thought it worth his while to visit the faraway marshlands. Simple people, yes, but rather touching, aren't they? The king called gaily as his men as they at his to his men as some ragged children gasped at the magnificent horses. They'd never seen animals so glossy and well fed in their lives. And where are we supposed to stay tonight? Flapoon muttered to Spittleworth, eyeing the trampled down stone cottage. No taverns here. Well, there's one comfort at least, Spittleworth whispered back. He'll have to rough it like the rest of us, and we'll see how much he likes it. They rode on through the afternoon, and at last, as the sun began to sink, they caught sight of the marsh where the Ickabog was supposed to live. A wide stretch of darkness studded with strange rock formations. Your Majesty, called Major Beamish, I suggest we set up camp now and explore the marsh in the morning. As your Majesty knows, the marsh can be treacherous. Fogs come suddenly here. We'd do best to approach it at daylight. Nonsense, said Fred, who was bouncing up and down in his saddle like an excited schoolboy. We can't stop now. When it's in sight, Beamish. The king had given his order, so the party rode on until at last, when the moon had risen and was sliding in and out behind inky clouds, they reached the edge of the marsh. It was the eeriest place any of them had ever seen. Wild and empty and desolate. A chilly breeze made the rushes whisper, but otherwise it was dead and silent. As you see, sir, said Lord Spittlesworth after a while, the ground is very boggy. Sheep and men alike would be sucked under it if they wandered out too far. Then the feeble minded might take these giant rocks and boulders for monsters in the dark. The rustling of these weeds might even be taken for the hissing of some creature. Yes, sir, very true, said King Fred, but his eyes still roamed over the dark marsh as though he expected the Ichabod to pop up from behind a rock. Shall we pitch camp then, sir? Asked Lord Flapoon, who'd saved some cold pies from Barristone and was eager for his supper. We can't expect to find even an imaginary monster in the dark, pointed out Spittlesworth. True, true, repeated King Fred regretfully. Let us, good gracious, how foggy it has become. And sure enough, as they stood looking out across the marsh, a thick white fog had rolled over them so swiftly and silent that none of them had noticed. And that is the end of that chapter. Now we're going to move on to chapter 12. Chapter 12. The King's Lost Sword. Within seconds, it was as though each of the king's party was wearing a thick white blindfold. The fog was so dense they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The mist smelled of the foul marsh, of brackish water and ooze. The soft ground seemed to shift beneath their feet as many of the men turned unwisely on the spot. Trying to catch sight of one another, they lost all sense of direction. Each man felt adrift in a blinding white sea, and Major Beamish was one of the few to keep his head. "Have a care," he called. "The ground is treacherous. Stay still. Don't attempt to move." But King Fred, who was suddenly feeling rather scared, paid no attention. He set off at once in what he thought was the direction of Major Beamish, but within a few steps he felt himself sinking into the icy marsh. "Help!" he cried, as the freezing marsh water flooded over the tops of his shining boots. "Help, Beamish! Where are you? I'm sinking!" There was an immediate clamor of panicked voices and jabbling armor. The guards all hurried off in every direction, trying to find the king, bumping into one another and slipping over, but the floundering king's voice drowned out everywhere. Other. "I've lost my boots. Why doesn't somebody help me? Where are you all?" The lords Spittleworth and Flapoon were the only two people who had followed Beamish's advice and remained quite still in the places they'd occupied when the fog had rolled over them. Spittleworth was clutching a fold of Flapoon's ample pantaloons, and Flapoon was holding tight to the skirt of Spittleworth's riding coat. Neither of them made the smallest attempt to help Fred, but waited shivering for calm to be restored. "At least if the fool gets swallowed by the bog, we'll be able to go home," Spittleworth muttered to Flapoon. The confusion deepened. Several of the royal guard had become stuck in the bog as they tried to find the king. The air was full of squelches, clanks, and shouts. Major Beamish was bellowing in a vain attempt to restore some kind of order, and the king's voice seemed to be receding into the blind night, becoming ever fainter, as though he was blundering away from them. And then out of the heart of the darkness came an awful terror-struck shriek. "Beamish, help me! I can see the monster!" "I'm coming, your majesty," cried Major Beamish. "Keep shouting, sir. I'll find you." "Help! Help! Help me, Beamish!" shouted King Fred. "What's happening to the idiot?" Flapoon asked Spittleworth, but before Spittleworth could answer, the fog around the two lords thinned as quick as it had arrived, so that they stood together in a little clearing, able to see each other, but still surrounded on all sides by high walls of thick white mist. The voices of the king, of Beamish, and of the other soldiers were becoming fainter and fainter. "Don't move yet," Spittlesworth cautioned Flapoon. "Once the fog thins a little bit more, we'll be able to find the horses, and we can retreat to a safe." At that precious moment, a slimy black figure burst out of the wall of fog and launched itself at the two lords. Flapoon let out a high-pitched scream, and Squidward lashed out at the creature, missing it only because it flopped to the ground, weeping. It was then that Spittleworth realized the gibbering, painting slime monster was, in fact, King Fred the Fearless. "Thank heavens we've found you, your majesty. We've been searching everywhere," cried Spittleworth. "Hic, hic, hic," whimpered the king. "He's got hiccups," said Flapoon. "Gave him a fright." "Hic, hic, Ickabog," moaned Fred. "I saw it. A giant monster. It nearly caught me." "I beg your majesty's pardon," asked Biddleworth. "The monster is real," gulped Fred. "I'm lucky to be alive. To the horses. We must flee, and quickly." King Fred tried to hoist himself up by climbing Spittlesworth's leg. But Spittleworth stepped swiftly aside to avoid getting covered in slime. Instead, aimed a consoling pat at the top of Fred's head, which was the cleanest part of him. There, 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 Your Majesty. You've had a most distressing experience falling in the marsh. As we were saying earlier, the boulders do indeed assume monstrous forms in this thick fog. Dash it, Spittlesworth, I know what I saw, shouted the king, staggering to his feet unaided. Tall as two horses, it was, and with eyes like huge lamps. I drew my sword, but my hand was so slimy it slipped from my grasp, so there was nothing for it but to pull my feet out of the stuck boots and crawl away. Just then, a fourth man made his way into their little clearing in the fog. Captain Roach, father of Roderick, who was Major Beamish's second in command, a big, burly man with a jet black mustache. What Captain Roach was really like, we are about to find out. All you need to know now is that the king was very glad to see him because he was the largest member of the royal guard. Did you see any signs of the Ickabog roach? Whimpered Fred. No, Your Majesty, he said with a respectful bow. All I've seen is fog and mud. I'm glad to know Your Majesty is safe. At any rate, you gentlemen stay here, and I'll round up the troops. Roach made to leave, but King Fred yelled, No, you stay here with me, Roach, in case the monster comes this way. You've still got a rifle, haven't you? Excellent. I lost my sword and my boots, you see, my very best dressed sword, with the jeweled hilt. Though he felt much safer with Captain Roach beside him, the trembling king was otherwise as cold and scared as he could ever remember being. He also had a nasty feeling that nobody believed he'd really seen the Ichabod, a feeling that increased when he caught sight of Spittleworth rolling his eyes at Flapoon. The king's pride was stung. Spittleworth, Flapoon, he said, I want my sword and my boots back. They're over there somewhere, he added, waving his arms at the encircling fog. Would would it not be better to wait until the fog has cleared, Your Majesty? Asked Spittleworth nervously. I want my sword, snapped King Fred. It was my grandfather's, and it's very valuable. Go and find it, both of you. I shall wait here with Captain Roach, and don't come back empty-handed. And that is the end of that chapter. We are on to 13, and we will save that for next time. All right, everyone, have a good day. I hope you enjoyed.